Notre pays produit suffisamment de quoi nous nourrir. Nous pouvons dépasser même notre production, malheureusement. Par manque d'organisation, nous sommes encore obligés de tendre la main pour demander des aides alimentaires. Ces aides alimentaires qui nous bloquent, qui nous inspirent, qui installent dans nos esprits cette habitude, ces réflexes de mendiants, d'assister. Nous devons mettre de côté ces aides par notre grande production. Il faut réussir à produire plus. Produire plus. Produire plus parce que il est normal que celui qui vous donne à manger vous dicte également ses volontés.
If you grew up in the West, you already know how selective storytelling works. Your textbooks taught you Martin Luther King Jr., but gave you a watered-down 2-page version of Malcolm X. It taught you Churchill, Roosevelt, and every European figure who shaped their world, but almost none of the African leaders who shaped ours. And that silence wasn't an oversight, it was intentional. Because the moment you learned about someone like Thomas Sankara, a young president who sold off the government's luxury fleet and replaced it with the cheapest car available as the official state vehicle, who fought corruption, championed women's rights, pushed for food sovereignty, rejected exploitative foreign debt, and rebuilt national identity in just 4 years, the entire narrative about Africa's supposed lack of leadership falls apart. That's why this episode matters, because so much of African history wasn't just misrepresented, it was edited to make African brilliance seem rare, accidental, or literally impossible. Reclaiming these stories isn't about hero worship. It's about restoring the truth, placing African leaders back into the global conversation they were cut out of, and reminding all of us, whether we're on the continent or in the diaspora, that our history is not defined by what the West chose to highlight. It's defined by what they chose to hide. And Sankara's story, both his rise and his erasure, is one of the clearest examples of that. Welcome back to They Lied About Africa. I'm your host, Numba, and if nobody told you the real story, I will. Today's episode actually falls under our Reclaiming the African Story pillar, the space on this podcast where we take back the African narratives that were distorted, minimized, or fragmented by colonial education, Western media, and even our own school systems. This pillar exists because you cannot build a healthy relationship with Africa, whether you're on the continent or in the diaspora, if the foundation of what you were taught is incomplete. It restores continuity. It reminds us that African leadership didn't begin with the few names Western institutions approved. It shows us that radical imagination, accountability, and nation building have always existed on the continent long before we were given permission to recognize them. And Thomas Sankara fits this pillar perfectly, not because he's a symbol or an aesthetic, but because his full story was deliberately edited down. His policies, his context, his vision, and even the forces that opposed him were reduced to quotes and myths. Reclaiming his story means putting all those pieces back together, the history before him, the revolution under him, and the legacy after him. So here's how this episode is structured. We're going to start with Burkina Faso before Sankara, the history, the colonial impact, and the instability that shaped the world he stepped into. Then we'll walk through his rise, his reforms, and the systemic pressures that led to his assassination. Now, all of this ties back to that opening question. Why is Sankara missing from the textbooks that shaped how we see the world? And what changes when we put him back? Well, let's begin with the story of Burkina Faso before Thomas Sankara. So if we're going to understand why Thomas Sankara mattered, why his leadership felt so disruptive, so dangerous to existing power, we have to rewind, not to 1983, not even to independence. We have to go all the way back to what existed before Africa was edited down to footnotes and failures, okay? Before Thomas Sankara, before coups and counter-coups, the land that we now call Burkina Faso already had history, real history, y'all. And no, it did not begin with France. So for centuries, this region was actually home to organized societies and powerful kingdoms, most notably the Mossi states. These weren't loose, unstable communities waiting to be civilized. They had systems of governance, land stewardship, military organization, and social accountability that endured for hundreds of years. Leadership was local, authority was understood, and political continuity existed long before European borders disrupted it. So that context matters because colonialism didn't arrive to build something new, it arrived to replace what already worked. In 1919, France carved out this territory into a colony called Upper Volta. But Upper Volta wasn't designed to be a nation, it was designed to be useful. The economy was reorganized around extraction and labor export. Men were sent to work on plantations and railways across French West Africa. Local food systems were deprioritized. Education wasn't meant to produce leaders, it was meant to produce clerks and intermediaries. Everything was structured to benefit the metropole, not the people actually on the land. And when independence came eventually in 1960, the damage didn't magically disappear because between 1960 and 1983, Upper Volta cycled through instability, military coups, short-lived governments, corruption, and deep economic dependence. The state existed, but sovereignty did not. Policies were shaped externally. Elites were benefiting. Ordinary people were left out. And the country remained one of the poorest in the world, not because of a lack of intelligence or effort, but because the system was never designed for self-determination. So by the time Thomas Sankara entered the picture, he wasn't stepping into a blank slate. That's the purpose of me explaining Burkina Faso prior to colonization. So that's very important to keep in mind. Because Thomas Sankara was stepping into a nation shaped by centuries of disruption, a place where leadership had been stripped of accountability and independence had been reduced to symbolism. That's the Burkina Faso Sankara inherited. And that's why what came next felt revolutionary, not just politically, but psychologically. So when we talk about the Burkina Faso Thomas Sankara inherited, which was unstable, externally controlled, disconnected from its people, the next question becomes obvious. Who even dares to challenge a system like that? And more importantly, where does someone like that come from? Because Thomas Sankara wasn't born a revolutionary icon. No, he wasn't raised to be a myth. He was a child of the very contradictions colonialism created. So Thomas Sankara was born in 1949 in what was still French-controlled Upper Volta. His family wasn't elite, but they weren't completely marginalized either, and that position mattered. He grew up watching how opportunity worked selectively, how proximity to power decided who advanced and who stayed stuck, how colonial structures shaped everyday life long before people ever talked about politics. Now, like many young men at the time, Sankara entered the military, not because he loved authority, but because military was one of the only paths open to education, mobility, and influence. But here's where his story starts to diverge. While training abroad, including in Madagascar, Sankara was exposed to anti-colonial movements, socialist ideas, and student uprisings. He didn't just learn military tactics. He learned how systems function, how exploitation is organized, how power is maintained, and how it can be challenged. And he read a lot. Marx, Lenin, Pan-African thinkers, you name them, but also African history that colonial education conveniently ignored. And instead of treating these ideas like abstract theory, he connected them to what he had already lived: poverty next to wealth, independence without sovereignty, and leadership without accountability. So when Sankara returned home, he stood out immediately, not because he was flashy, but because he was different. This man rode a bicycle. Instead of driving luxury cars, he spoke plainly. He criticized corruption openly, even when it made his superiors feel uncomfortable. And most dangerously of all, he believed leadership should look like the people it serves. Now, by the early 1980s, Sankara had become popular with students, workers, and young people, the very groups excluded from power. But that popularity came at a cost. To the ruling elite, he wasn't just idealistic, he was threatening. And that tension between a system built on hierarchy and a leader insisting on accountability is what sets the stage for what happens next, because Sankara didn't rise quietly, and power doesn't give itself up without a fight. Now, by the early 1980s, the tension around Thomas Sankara had reached a breaking point. He wasn't just criticizing corruption in private meetings, he was saying it publicly. He wasn't quietly navigating power, he was challenging its legitimacy. And in a political system built on silence, hierarchy, and external approval, that made him a problem. In 1983, Sankara was arrested by the government, not for a crime, but for his ideas. And something unexpected happened. People reacted. Students protested. Workers mobilized. Soldiers sympathized. This wasn't elite politics playing out behind closed doors. This was popular frustration spilling into the streets. Sankara represented something rare, a leader who sounded like the people, lived like the people, and wasn't afraid to name the system hurting them. When he was released and installed as president through a military-backed popular uprising, Sankara didn't pretend this was business as usual. He called it what it was: a revolution. Not a change in leadership, a change in logic. Thomas Sankara made his vision clear immediately. Independence without sovereignty was meaningless, and development without dignity was hollow. And leadership that separated itself from the people was illegitimate. So he started with the state itself. He slashed government salaries, including his own. Ministers were banned from flying first class. The fleet of luxury cars was sold off, and the Renault 5, one of the cheapest cars on the market, became the official state vehicle. Not as a PR stunt, but as a rule, because Sankara believed corruption did not start with bribes. It started with distance between leaders and the realities of their citizens. Then came the reforms, and they came really fast. In public health, Sankara's government launched nationwide vaccination campaigns against meningitis, measles, and yellow fever. And in a matter of weeks, millions of children were vaccinated at a time when international institutions claimed African states lacked the capacity to deliver mass public health programs. Sankara proved that what was framed as incapacity was often just political neglect. And in education, literacy became a national emergency. Schools were expanded. Teachers were mobilized. Education wasn't treated as charity or a long-term hope. It was treated as infrastructure, as something a nation builds deliberately. But one of the most radical and controversial aspects of Sankara's revolution was his approach to women's liberation. He openly called the oppression of women a form of internal colonialism. He argued that a society could not claim freedom while half of its population remained excluded from power, education, and economic participation. His government outlawed forced marriages and female genital cutting, otherwise known as FGM. Women were also appointed to high-ranking positions in the government. Men were encouraged to take on domestic labor, not symbolically but publicly, to normalize the idea that gender roles were political, not natural. This wasn't framed as copying the West. Sankara was very explicit. Women's liberation was necessary for African development on African terms. And also environmentally, his administration tackled desertification head-on. Millions of trees were planted across the country through national mobilization campaigns. This wasn't outsourced to NGOs or framed as a donor project. It was a collective action, because sustainability for Sankara was not abstract. It was about whether future generations would survive on land. And economically, Sankara pushed for food sovereignty. Burkina Faso shifted towards local agriculture rather than export dependency. Farmers were supported instead of exploited. Grain production increased. The country moved closer to feeding itself, a radical act in a global system designed to keep African economies dependent on imports and aid. And then there was foreign policy, where Sankara became truly dangerous. See, on the international stage, he rejected the logic of foreign debt outright. He called it a tool of neo-colonial control imposed by institutions like the IMF, otherwise known as the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, not to help African nations develop, but to discipline them politically. He challenged African leaders to act collectively, to refuse payment, to stop negotiating individually from positions of weakness. He warned that debt would never be forgiven, only enforced. And he said this openly at international forums without softening his language. Now, this made him very popular, obviously, with youth, activists, and Pan-Africanists across the continent. It also made him deeply unpopular with African elites tied to foreign interests and with global powers accustomed to compliant leadership. And in just 4 years, Burkina Faso was visibly changing, not perfect, not free of tension, but undeniably different. People felt involved in a governance for the first time. Leadership felt close, accountability felt possible, and that's the part that's often erased. Sankara didn't fail because his ideas didn't work. He became a threat because they did. And when a leader begins to prove that Africa's underdevelopment is political, not inevitable, the response from entrenched power is rarely reform. It's removal, right? Now, by the mid-1980s, something unusual was happening in Burkina Faso. It wasn't perfection, it wasn't a utopia, but a movement, right? Because for the first time since independence, ordinary people weren't just governed, they were mobilized. And that shift reshaped society in ways that went far beyond individual policies. Let's talk about social change. Under Sankara's leadership, citizenship stopped being passive. Neighborhoods organized themselves. Villages participated in local decision-making through committees for the defense of the revolution. Public campaigns emphasized collective responsibility, not charity, not aid, but shared ownership of the nation's direction. This didn't eliminate inequality or hardship necessarily, but it changed expectations. People began to see themselves not as recipients of government action, but as contributors to national life. And that's huge. That psychological shift from dependency to participation is one of the most documented social changes of the period. Okay? And also, literacy rates were rising. Preventable diseases were declining. Women became more visible in public life, not only in leadership roles, but in everyday social norms. Scholars even note that even critics of the revolution acknowledge this period produced an unusually high level of civic engagement for a low-income country in the 1980s. Let's talk about some economic shifts that happened. Now, economically, Burkina Faso remained poor by global standards, but the direction of its economy changed. So rather than measuring success by foreign investment or aid inflows, the state emphasized domestic production, like I mentioned earlier, local consumption, and reduce import dependence. This didn't make the country wealthy overnight, obviously, but it did reduce vulnerability. Food production started to increase. Budget priorities shifted towards social infrastructure, and government spending became more transparent, and public expectations of fiscal restraint hardened. Now, for a brief period, it became politically unacceptable for leaders to display excessive personal wealth as well. Economists studying this era often describe it as a rare attempt to redefine development, not as growth at any cost, but as resilience and self-sufficiency, an approach largely abandoned after Sankara's death. Let's talk about political restructuring. Now, politically, the most striking change was not institutional, I think. I think it was relational because leadership became visible, accessible, and legible, and officials were expected to justify their decisions publicly. Now, corruption, while not eliminated, carried reputational consequences. Authority was no longer insulated by ritual or excess. This closeness also created friction. The same mechanism that empowered citizens, popular communities, public criticism, mass mobilization sometimes blurred lines between accountability and coercion. Political scientists continue to debate this tension, whether the revolution strengthened democracy by widening participation or weakened it by centralizing ideological control. What's not debated is this: the political culture was transformed. Expectations change, and once expectations rise, they are difficult to reverse. Now let's move on to cultural transformation. Culturally, Sankara's era re-centered dignity. National identity was reclaimed. Literally, Upper Volta became Burkina Faso, the land of the upright people. That's its exact translation. Local clothing was promoted. Public speeches rejected inferiority narratives, and African history and pride were emphasized not as nostalgia but as psychological infrastructure. This mattered deeply for a post-colonial society taught to associate modernity with imitation. Cultural confidence became part of governance, and for many young people at the time, this was the first moment they saw African leadership modeled without apology. That cultural shift, subtle but profound, is why Sankara's image endures far beyond his years in office. Now, I think it's really important to also touch upon his public perception, because this man was not only loved, he was also resented, and today he's remembered, okay? Now, his public perception during his rule was not unanimous. He was admired by the youth, workers, and marginalized communities, like I mentioned earlier, but he was also resented by traditional elites, some unions, and sectors affected by rapid reform. He was praised internationally by activists and intellectuals and quietly isolated by powerful states. Now, what makes this period historically significant is not universal approval. It's polarization. Sankara forced a conversation about what African leadership could look like, and once that conversation started, it could not be undone. And today, historians, economists, and sociologists largely agree on one thing: that Sankara's years permanently altered political imagination in Burkina Faso. Not because everything succeeded, but because something changed. People saw that alternatives were possible, that poverty was not destiny, that leadership did not have to imitate former masters to be legitimate. And that realization, more than any single policy, is why this period still matters. Now, we need to get into the pressure, the tensions, and the road to 1987. So by the mid-1980s, the question surrounding Thomas Sankara was no longer whether his leadership was disruptive. It was who could tolerate that disruption and for how long, right? Because revolutions don't collapse all at once. They fracture. So Sankara did not govern alone. That's something I think we all need to keep in mind. He relied on a coalition of military officers, civilian revolutionaries, and grassroots organizations, so groups that did not always share the same priorities. Now, inside the government, tensions grew over pace and power. Some allies believe reforms were moving too quickly, creating unnecessary enemies. Others argue Sankara was centralizing authority around himself, even as he preached popular participation. The committees for the defense of the revolution, designed to democratize governance, were increasingly criticized for overreach, inconsistency, and intimidation at the local level. These critiques were all fabricated, and Sankara didn't always resolve them efficiently. As pressure mounted, disagreements hardened into rival camps, not over whether Burkina Faso should change, but how and who controlled that change. Now, traditional elites, senior civil servants, business interests, and political figures tied to the pre-revolutionary order experience Sankara's government not as reform, but as dispossession. Privileges were stripped. Salaries were cut. Land reform disrupted patronage networks. Public criticism replaced quiet negotiation. For the elites accustomed to influence without accountability, this was an ideological disagreement. It was existential threat. Literally. Over time, these groups became increasingly aligned with dissatisfied military officers and foreign interests who saw Sankara not as an idealist, but as a destabilizer. Now let's talk about the international dynamics and how isolation wasn't accidental. Now globally, Sankara governed during the late Cold War, a period when African governments were expected to choose alignment and remain predictable. Sankara did neither. That man said no. He rejected structural adjustment programs promoted by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, refusing to cut social spending or privatize national assets in exchange for loans. This made Burkina Faso financially isolated, not because aid disappeared, but because it was withheld conditionally. Foreign governments, and particularly France, viewed Sankara as a liability, not because he was violent or unstable, but because he openly challenged neo-colonial influence and encouraged other African leaders to do the same. Isolation increased pressure internally, resources were tightened, allies wavered, and Sankara's refusal to soften his stance narrowed his margin for survival. Now let's talk about the final fracture, October of 1987. One of the most common points, actually, before I get into this, of confusion is this. Sankara was not removed by an external invasion. He was killed by people inside of his own circle. Now, on October 15th of 1987, during a meeting at the presidential compound, Sankara was assassinated along with several close associates. The coup was led by Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's longtime friend, second in command. The official justification claimed Sankara had betrayed the revolution and endangered national stability, but the speed with which policies were reversed afterwards makes clear that this was not a correction, it was a reversal. Sankara was just 37 years old, and for years the circumstances of his death were deliberately obscured. His body was buried quickly, public mourning was even discouraged, discussions of his leadership were suppressed. So erasure wasn't an accident, it was a strategy. Now, under Compaoré, Burkina Faso rapidly realigned with Western governments and international financial institutions. Market-oriented reforms were introduced, relations with France became normalized, and political rhetoric softened. Now, stability returned, but at a cost, because corruption increased and inequality widened. Civic participation declined, and Sankara's name became politically dangerous to invoke for decades. What had been radical imagination was replaced with cautious governance. What had been popular mobilization was replaced with managed politics. For many Burkinabe, the contrast was stark, and that contrast between what was briefly existed and what followed is why Sankara's memory could never be fully erased. Because even when revolutions are crushed, they leave behind comparison, and comparison is very dangerous. Now let's talk about his legacy today, because he didn't become powerful after his death. He became relevant, right? Because legacies don't survive on nostalgia alone. They survive when new generations recognize themselves in unfinished struggles. And that's exactly what's happening right now. Across the entire African continent and throughout the diaspora, Sankara's name keeps resurfacing. Not because governments are celebrating him, but because young people are searching for leadership that doesn't feel performative, searching for politics that don't feel rigged, searching for proof that Africa's future doesn't have to look like a slightly better version of its past. Among scholars, Sankara is often described as a rare case, a leader who attempted structural transformation without first securing elite comfort or foreign approval. His speeches are studied not as rhetoric, but as ideological clarity, especially his insistence that underdevelopment is political, not natural. Among activists, Sankara represents something even more intimate: alignment. The alignment between words and lifestyle, between power and restraint, between critique and sacrifice. In an era where corruption is often treated as inevitable, Sankara is remembered as evidence that leadership can choose discipline even when it's unpopular. And among Gen Z, especially Gen Z Africans and children of the diaspora, Sankara is something else entirely. He feels legible. This is the generation that grew up watching institutions fail in real time. Governments promise reform when inequality deepens. Leaders preach nationalism while storing wealth abroad. Aid flows in, but dignity never seems to follow. And Gen Z sees all of it because, unlike previous generations, they're connected, comparative, and constantly exposed to how power operates globally. So when they encounter Sankara, they don't see perfection. They see contrast. They see a leader who didn't sell aspiration. He modeled it. Who didn't ask young people to wait. He trusted them with responsibility. We didn't outsource Africa's future. He insisted it to be built from within. That's why his ideas have resurged so strongly in the 2020s. This is a decade defined by rupture. Global trust is low. Economic systems feel very brittle. Climate crisis is unavoidable. And across Africa, youth populations are expanding faster than political systems are adapting. Not even kidding. The result is pressure, creative, restless, and often exploitative pressure. And in that pressure, Sankara's message resonates not as an ideology, but as permission. Permission to question debt as destiny. Permission to reject corruption as culture. Permission to believe that leadership can be accountable to the people, not insulated for them. And in movements calling for sovereignty, whether it's economic, political, or cultural, Sankara's language echoes loudly, not always quoted, not always named, but present in the insistence that Africa must negotiate with the world from a position of dignity, not desperation. In anti-corruption movements, his life stands as a rebuke, not because corruption disappeared underneath him. It didn't. But because he refused to normalize it. He made integrity visible, and visibility matters. Once people see that another standard is possible, the old excuses stop working. And in youth-led organizing, Sankara symbolizes something especially powerful: belief in youth capacity. He governed as a young man in a system that equated age with authority. He trusted young people not just as supporters, but as participants. And that trust is exactly why young Africans feel is missing today. But here's where Sankara's legacy becomes most important, I think, and most misunderstood. He is not a template. He is not asking to be resurrected, rebranded, or copied. History doesn't repeat cleanly, and Sankara's context was specific: Cold War politics, post-independence fragility, revolutionary momentum that cannot simply be recreated. What Sankara offers is a framework of questions. Who does development serve? Who pays for stability? Who benefits from silence? And what kind of leadership are we willing to tolerate or challenge? Now, for Gen Z Africans and the diaspora, reclaiming Sankara isn't about longing for a lost past. It's about expanding the imagination of what's possible. It's about refusing the lie that Africa has never produced principled leadership. And it's about understanding that sovereignty begins not with borders, but with mindset. Sankara's true legacy is not that he had all the answers. It's that he refused to accept questions that were designed to limit African possibility. And that refusal, especially today, is a form of power. Now, reclaiming his story is not about going backward. It's about expanding what we believe is possible going forward. Because once you understand that leaders like Thomas Sankara existed and that they were removed not for incompetence but for disruption, you stop accepting shallow explanations about Africa's condition. You start asking better questions. You demand better standards, and you recognize that the future of the continent and its people at home and abroad will not be handed down. It will be built carefully, critically, and collectively. And that is what reclaiming Sankara's story ultimately asks of Gen Z, of us, of me, of you. Not admiration, not limitation, but responsibility.